Hello. How are y'all? Y'all are here. And you didn't freeze. So happy to hear that. Well, okay. Your yards might have frozen. We still have, I'm looking at ice out there still. But welcome. Welcome to today's Tuesday live stream. Q&A. We are today doing a topic on what the cold does to the oil field. Been some questions on that. Normally, I can imagine people curious what happens. I know that myself, seeing the ERCOT, like being in Texas, we have our grid of power, and they have our little dashboards, especially after the fun we had. What was it, 5 years ago? There's a lot more dashboards than there used to be, like reporting what type of fuel sources are being used, and you can just see it change quite a bit whenever things get cold. So lots of questions as to why that might happen. Also some questions from what happens with offshore. How does that work with the cold water versus what type of oil it is, and how is it piped? Quite a few questions that came in over the last week. So thank you guys for submitting questions. As always, you can put questions in the chat. You can, I have a little note there. Please try not to share personal information. This is a live chat that is available to the public. So, if you wouldn't tell the internet, please don't put it here. For your privacy, we don't disclose any information. Even if you email us a question, you are able to email a question. It's tracy@pecantreeog.com. If you need to email something and have additional information that you'd like asked. And then Crystal has not joined us yet, which is a little surprising because I do have my lunch I haven't eaten here yet, so usually she'd be asking for that. But I also have a daughter home today because schools are closed, so I think daughter's eating lunch, and she's an easier target than I am for Crystal. So probably Crystal will join us whenever Sydney's done with her lunch. That's my guess. But I do have the Crystal cam ready for whenever she does end up joining. If this is your first time hearing any of this, Crystal is my dog, and there's somewhere back here she normally lays during the live stream. So I put a camera on her because she's much more interesting than oil and gas. So, and I think interesting is probably the right word for Crystal, right, Mom? But I'm holding my cup really weird. That's a weird way to hold a cup like this. That's wrong. It felt wrong. Okay. So let's see. Hi, Mary. Hi, Fred. Hi, Alice. Anyone else in the chat? Thank you for joining us today. I think everything's working today. Knock on wood. No one's told me they can't hear me yet. So we're going to go ahead and assume that it's all working unless I get a text message. One last check. All right. We're going to run with it. Can y'all hear me? Right? We're good? I need a confirmation, I think. I just suddenly got insecure about all of this. Okay, all working. Thank you so much. We've just had a long run of several things in a row that I just like to double check on these things. Okay. Thank you. It's all just a ploy to get extra chat interaction, right? Just pretend like I can't hear y'all and make y'all chat more. Just kidding. I would never do that. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So again, if y'all have additional questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and we're going to get rolling. I actually had a little time to prep today. Oh, that's funny. That's a funny to have your own picture on there. We'll do desktop view. That's a little better. Okay. What does cold do to oil? So as in the past, we'll have a main topic and then go into other questions from there. So we'll just dive right in. Okay. Hopefully, y'all are okay with my makeshift presentation here. Okay. All right, so what happens to oil fields during winter storms? So here in the south, snow and ice and all that stuff is abnormal. However, it's not the most abnormal thing for a lot of oil and gas areas. If you think of Alaska, Canada, even North Dakota, there's quite a bit of cold weather. And so, you know, what causes wells to even stop producing if they can produce there, and then what can be done, and then what's the normal route? Like, you know, all good questions. So, you know, the thing that usually gets an oil field first when you're talking about cold weather is when oil wells produce, they don't just produce oil and gas. There's usually a bit of water that comes along with it. And as we all know, water likes to freeze much easier than oil does. If you've ever put a bottle of any type of oily anything in the fridge or freezer, or I mean, it wouldn't freeze in the fridge, that wouldn't make sense. But if you've ever put it in the freezer, it also takes a while to freeze. And then usually if anything does freeze in that bottle, it's the water component of that vinaigrette or whatever you accidentally threw in the freezer. And so when you're thinking of anything freezing, that's your pain points. So any places where liquids can accumulate or get stuck, or low spots in the pipe where water might, you know, if you have oil flowing through, water might get stuck there, because oil floats on water. So that's one aspect. So if you stop things from producing, you're more likely to get the water to settle. You're more likely to allow things to freeze. And then eventually oil does, you know, solidify, and gas, you know, things can fall out of the gas, like the liquids can fall out of the gas and start freezing up, you know, small little openings and chokes in the pipes. And eventually it, you know, gas wells, it doesn't take a whole lot in order to upset their balance when they're producing. And so, even though gas wells don't have a lot of liquids associated with them, when those liquids do plug up anything, it can really throw a wrench in the like delicate balance that some of those gas wells are in. And then also some of the equipment that keeps things running. In terms of oil wells that have equipment pumping, like you have your pumping units on the surface. I do have some videos pulled up, but you know, just more for images. But the equipment freezing is usually the thing that stops it from producing. And so you wouldn't ahead of time go and shut it in, because you'd probably just cause more problems. So ideally you keep it producing and try to keep that warm liquid flowing through. So it's very similar to like letting your pipes drip, if you're like right there on the border of it freezing or not. I know that technique does not work in the north, or even when it gets significantly cold at all in the south. But as a southerner, if you just let your pipes flow or drip a little bit, that can usually keep things from freezing. And it's very similar in the oil field. If you keep things moving, it'll keep it from freezing. The ground is very warm, and so the deeper you go, the more warm it gets. And so if you're able to bring that warmth up and get it into the equipment, that's usually the easiest way to heat up the equipment, as long as it's not too cold. Now, it doesn't take much to get that too cold. And so that's when you have things like winterizing that comes into play. And one of the big stories from was it 4 or 5 years ago, whatever, the Texas like big freeze where the power system failed. That was primarily, there wasn't enough focus on winterizing the important places that needed winterized. So winterizing allows for either protection, like housing of the important pumps that you really don't want any component of that to freeze, the valves, the transfer stations, the um, the sensitive parts of the pipelines, anywhere where you really need that equipment to just never freeze. The the easiest way to do that is usually just to put it in a little protective like house, like a little outhouse looking thing. Um, that can, so you'll see these little outhouses around, and a lot of times that's protecting the big equipment, or protecting the equipment that you don't want to be exposed to the elements. There's also winterizing that you can do where you're wrapping the pipes, insulating the pipes, putting protective coatings on it. There's a lot of chemical winterizing that happens, and having chemical systems that circulates antifreeze basically. 2021 Texas grid failure. Yeah, I was thinking it was 2021, but we also had that follow-up storm, and I couldn't remember which one it was that killed my plants. So we had just, we moved into our house in the end of 2019. 2020 delayed our it was a brand new build, so all of our I guess plant installs were delayed, which was not a big deal in the grand scheme of things. But then they were finally installed or like planted in January of 2021. And I think it was maybe 2 weeks later. Maybe it was December that project was finished. And then a week or two later, all my fruit trees and everything just got obliterated by that storm. No amount of protection kept that alive. Yeah. Okay. 2021. So the more proactive operators and the operators that are better at maintenance are better at keeping this from happening. So let's go ahead and look at some videos. A lot of this is from this is from 4 years ago. So this must have been that secondary, like the ice storm when everybody was worried about what happened the prior year. And then we had that big ice storm the next year. Fred, you lost a lot of plants, new bushes and landscaping in front of our house. Terrible timing for us too. Yeah. It's like we were all home and wanting to improve our houses, right? And then all of a sudden nature was not cooperating with that at all. Yeah, man, I lost a peach tree. I didn't lose my pecan tree, thank goodness. But that one was one that survived, which has just been this poor tree. It's been a symbolic tree, that's for sure. Like we planted it because of starting pecan tree, and it's had a run, but it's been symbolic. So it's still alive, producing pecans now. But yeah, I lost fig tree, couple persimmons. There were a lot of casualties. Okay. So this is some from News West 9. It's just the Texas oil. I think what did they say he was? Okay, yeah. So these are all the different pipes, and these systems are the things that end up freezing. So these big separator stations. So this is a production facility, and this is where all of the wells are producing too. So it can freeze a lot of different places. So it can freeze at the well. Excuse me. It can freeze at the well, or it could freeze at the production facility. And if you think of all these pipes, this is where things are most likely to freeze because you have the most stuff exposed to the elements. And normally you're actually painting these things black if you're trying to absorb as much heat as possible from the sun. And honestly, that's why they're painted black. You're usually having to paint them the color that's predominantly in the area. So West Texas, you're going to see a lot of tan tanks. But in areas of the country where you have more greenery, you have different colors of tanks that can be placed. But if they're painted black, then that means they're trying to absorb as much heat as possible. And the reason they're trying to absorb the heat is because heat helps the oil and gas and water separate into their components to be processed correctly. So you have some of these tanks are meant to, as the first, tank that all the fluids come into. And then that does the first layer of separation, and the gas goes to these big tall ones to help knock out any other little liquids. And then the gas eventually comes off the top. And then the water goes to these really, really big tanks because, either you might have one of those as a water tank and the rest of them as oil tanks, or they might all be water tanks, or they might all be oil tanks. It depends on how much is producing from that particular facility. But this is where all the liquids are going through all these pipes. So, one option is to bury them. Burying them makes it to where that is an insulating layer. However, then it is harder to make repairs, make replacements, see leaks when they happen. And so there's pros and cons to doing that. So the norm is to not bury them across most of the oil and gas producing areas of at least the South. But it is becoming, the amount that each individual operator puts into, I guess, maintenance and reducing downtime varies quite a bit. So you're going to see a wide range of protection of the equipment. And I've actually heard quite a bit of stories of people going out to the well site and looking at the meters, and as one owner said, like, oh, it's not too hard to poke around on those meters and figure out what the well's producing. And I'm just like thinking like, oh gosh, please be safe, because I'm just imagining someone getting, pulling up their sedan to an oil and gas producing field and like tapping around on things. And he told me that he has some background in oil and gas, so it wasn't quite as scary, I guess, then. But, then it's almost a little worse because sometimes, I guess, too much. Yeah, it's... Anyway, if you're going to go up to a well site, be careful. That's all I'm going to say. Please, maybe don't, but if you have to, if you're going to, be safe. Don't touch things that you, ideally don't touch anything. But I do understand wanting to know what's happening on your property if it's one of your wells. But ideally go with one of the pumpers or one of the operators and have them, show you around. But they're usually pretty happy to show people around. It's a nice, easy way to keep people happy. But that's all of this stuff may or may not be enclosed. It's probably not. So it's probably out in the open. It might have a fence around it. But if you see like a little outhouse around some of this, either it's a noise thing or it's a protection from the elements thing. Let's see, any other interesting images? Oh yeah, a lot of these valves and pressure controls are what's, keeping the fluid moving and properly dumping the fluids when it gets to a certain level. And so it actually doesn't take a whole lot to get that balance out. So there's a lot of little places that can freeze. See, this is probably a repair. I don't want to assume, but yeah, there's a lot of valves that can freeze. Yeah, this is pretty typical of just a whole bunch of pipes, and those are all the things that cause problems. The other thing that causes problems is power going down, as mentioned here. So when power goes down, a lot of these wells are run off of electricity in order to run those pumping units. And so if you don't have electricity, then you don't have the power to run that. And then it becomes a worsening cycle if you're relying on that production to keep things moving, and then the power goes down, then things freeze, and then you don't have either one, right? So it can be a compounding problem. Let's see. There was another video. So the Zach Life is a channel on YouTube here. If you found my channel, you probably found his channel too. I think we get recommended, like if you've watched this, maybe you'll like this back and forth. At least I've heard that. I actually like his channel quite a bit. It is a different type of facility that he's dealing with. So he's dealing with the older facilities that have just a different setup. But this video, which I'll link, he has one, do oil wells freeze cold weather production? And that goes a little more into what does he do? What does he have to repair? As you can tell, it's very, it's a different facility type of setup that he has going on here. But when it comes to, like, does he know his stuff? I like to equate it to, I would much rather have a mechanic, or I don't know his technical background. I'll just say that I haven't looked into his technical background. But when it comes to if I'd rather have a mechanic keeping my car running or a mechanical engineer keeping my car running, I'd much rather have the mechanic. It's kind of like, would you rather have a doctor or a nurse take your blood sample? When it comes to the actually doing of the things and the day in, day out, like you want the people who are doing it day in, day out to be in charge of those. I mean, the underlying fundamentals of why and maybe how, yeah. That's where people like us come into place. But he knows his stuff on how to keep this equipment maintained and running, and that's where the specialty is. And so for his unique type of assets that he's dealing with things that, you know, you couldn't afford to put a giant outhouse over every single well if it's producing 1 or 2 barrels a day. And so that's where you just have to take other protective measures. And that's a lot of the stuff he talks about is you just keep it moving, keep it running. And then if you know it's not going to, you preemptively shut it in so you don't accidentally break something. But also a lot of his stuff already has artificial lift on it. So if it stops producing, you already have something on it to help it get producing again. While other newer wells might not have that, like you're relying on the natural production of the reservoir in order to keep it flowing. And so when it stops, you have to get it flowing again. So there's just a lot of different considerations that you might be taking into place. Here was a nice little animation. Wild Well Control is one of those companies that, well, they're primarily to help, you know, keep wells in control, but they have a lot of different technology. So this was kind of just a one from, what's that, 9 years ago, showing how they can wrap some of these. It's kind of like when they spray insulate your house, it looks like. And they do that foam insulation in your walls. Looks like this is a way they can do that on the pipes. So yeah, there's a lot of different things that they can do to help protect and insulate. Okay. Oh, I was gonna pull up the grid. So this is Texas system for the supply and demand, and what resources are powering the state, and so most of Texas is on this system. As you can see here in green, it's all the stuff in green here is the Texas system. And that was kind of interesting when it went to this fuel mix. I kind of find this fuel mix interesting. And something that I noticed looking at it this last weekend versus, you know, several years prior when we were looking at it was there's quite a bit more power storage than was the last time I looked. And also the solar has increased quite a bit. Wind, we've always had a pretty big wind component to our natural gas, at least for the last 5 years or so. But I don't remember solar being as large as it is now. But it, we've had so many solar farms and fields being installed like on a very large scale, and a lot of folks who contact us are either being leased from a solar field or trying to negotiate around a solar field, and so um, they're quite impressive. I mean, I I'm a little torn on how I feel about solar, just because it's an interesting use of land resources. But in terms of how impressive they are to look at, they are very impressive. I at least underestimated the scale of when you talk about a solar farm, just exactly how big you're talking. Um, but so that was kind of interesting. Like right now, this is as of right now, we're at almost 40% of Texas's power is solar. So we're midday. I mean, that makes sense. Midday in a state that produces a lot of sunshine, that makes sense. And then wind, another 10%, and natural gas is only 31%. And we still have coal and lignite and nuclear. Oh my gosh, my Texas came out. I'm sorry. I said nuclear. I do know how to say and spell it. Nuclear. My Texas came out. I apologize. But what's interesting is even to this day, even with as much solar and wind and whatnot, I believe I was looking, we used quite a bit of power storage during the peak of the, dead of the night, frozen times, because there was quite a bit of outages still. I mean, you're just naturally going to get those outages. And natural gas was, I think, 80% at the peak that I looked at. I don't know how to go back and look at. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yeah, so this is the last 24 hours of the fuel mix. And so during the peak of the sunshine, we get a good 40% through solar. But then when you get to the cold of the night, that's 70% natural gas. And then, let's see, next one is coal, is this chunk here. Nuclear is 7 or 8%, and this is wind. So still a good amount of wind, but it's just interesting. We're still relying quite a bit on natural gas. So luckily, natural gas doesn't stop flowing for the most part. All right. I'm sure we'll see some interesting stories about pricing as this all goes to play. I don't know if you can see historical prices, but so it's all green right now, but it was maxed out red middle of last night, we'll just say. And so short-term surge pricing, that's when the statements vary quite a bit month to month when you have a gas well. That is partly why it is so dependent on weather and the local demand for that product. So we see it every single Texas freeze. I'm sure other parts of the country see it too, where you'll see 1 or 2 days or a month or a week of extremely high pricing. And sometimes that will happen at the same time that a well came online. Sometimes it will happen when a well came off. And it just makes it very confusing to try to track what's happening if you're looking at it in a vacuum and not considering the fact that prices doubled for that particular month. Because also, usually, you won't see this for another 2-3 months on your statements. So this is happening in January. So sometime in March or April is when the impact of these higher prices will hit the statements that are going to people's checkbooks. And or not checkbooks. It's where the checking accounts, like when the check is deposited. So by that time, you're not thinking of the freeze that happened back in January. You're thinking of what happened last month maybe, and just remember that it's whatever happened that production month, that particular contract, that particular area where that well was. Okay. And then also just a reminder, there's quite a bit of Canadian oil and gas production. Producing in the snow is a normal thing. So, okay. Next question. So another one we had is, can offshore rigs only drill for light oil? And the reason this came around was because of the Venezuela video. There was questions on, okay, well, if you're trying to produce stuff offshore, does it have to be just light oil? Is that why we have all that offshore production? Like, how does that even work? And so it can be produced. Heavy oil can be produced offshore. How heavy is usually the question that you're talking about? Like, what are you talking about when you're saying heavy? Yeah, the viscosity in cooling is the issue, not freezing. There's a lot of things else that you're dealing with when you're talking about offshore production. Because yes, the reservoirs are usually warmer because they're deeper, but then as soon as they hit the water column, it's a very cold water column at the bottom of the ocean. And so there's a lot of changing of temperatures that you're having to deal with. And when gas gets extremely cold, something called methane hydrates form. And that's kind of like gas crystals, if you want to think of it, methane ice in a way. And so that can block production also. There's a lot of considerations in trying to keep things flowing from the bottom to the top. But the other question was, okay, well, when you produce it though, what happens to that production? And which is a major, question when you're talking about offshore production. Now I will say I am not an offshore specialist. I'm an onshore specialist. So I do have some offshore experience, but it's limited, and especially in the grand scheme of people that have offshore experience, mine is extremely limited. But there's a variety of types of offshore platforms, which makes questions like this make a little more sense. Oh gosh. Hi, Sydney. So as you can tell, my daughter is home. I did not know you could chat on YouTube. I guess we will have to figure that one out after the stream. But, okay. So I pulled up one image of offshore piping. I thought this was it's a little blurry, but I thought this was a good depiction of what's happening. There's a mixture of pipelines that are connected to production and ones that are standalone. There's names for all of these. We won't go into the official names, but there's some that are floating platforms where they are out there, like they're geo-positioning themselves and with anchors, and they're just big boats that look like they're platforms. There's some that have feet that go all the way down to the ocean floor. There's some that actually look like a boat, but they're, they all have to be connected to the reservoir somehow. And so a lot of times you'll have this like freestanding riser or something like that, that will connect down to the ocean floor. And then depending on the field and how large it is, how much, how close it is to the shoreline, how close it is to other fields, if you're able to connect the pipelines, the subsea pipelines together. There's quite a bit of pipeline happening offshore that you can't see, connecting these fields together. And that's usually happening along the ocean floor. And there's if you get too deep, you'll have these remote vehicles that will do a lot of the plumbing, I guess you could say. But to a certain depth, you have these divers that have a very, very dangerous job. But that's what they do, is they're subsea plumbers, I guess you can say. And it's quite a interesting industry. But That is happening, and usually the oil is light enough and hot enough that that will flow. But again, there's a lot of, it's the same idea. You keep things running, you keep things moving, you inject solvents if you need to, you insulate if you need to, all those things. Yeah, great image showing what goes on in the offshore drilling. Yeah, the most of the ones that hit the headlines are these type of ones where it's so deep that you usually don't have something going all the way down to the bottom. If you're talking about deep water Gulf of Mexico, for example, which, oh my gosh, that reminds me, Sydney looks like a roller coaster. Yeah, that I don't know how fun that roller coaster would be. I think it'd be quite cold and hard to breathe. But I actually saw when I was researching on Chevron's website, they actually called it Gulf of America. Is that? I thought that all was a joke, but we won't get into that. Anyway, it was interesting. So I'm gonna call it Gulf of Mexico for life. But then okay, there was another interesting question. While we're a little off topic, I'll go ahead and hop down to this one. And this was a fun little like thought question, and it was presented in a fun way. But oh wait, no, this one. Could someone live on an abandoned oil rig? And we won't get into the politics, but so engineering versus legal reality. Let's separate legal from this. There's quite a bit of corrosion resistance and maintenance that you'd have to maintain. Normally they're decommissioned. And from what I understand, I don't know if this is like propaganda that I've been fed as being part of the oil industry, but from what I understand, they make pretty good wildlife refuge, like places for things to live and hide, and an ecosystem. Like when they decommission them and they sit on the ocean floor, they kind of make like pseudo reefs, from what I understand. Again, that could just be propaganda that I've been fed, but it sounds reasonable to me because if you think of, even just birdhouses is kind of a similar thing. So great for fishing. Yeah, that's what I've heard too, is they make really good fishing. Even Southern Louisiana, when I lived in Southern Louisiana, they'd go and you'd fish nearby because there's usually algae and things growing on that, and then that provides food for the fish, and then that provides food for the food, and then yeah. So, it theoretically makes for a good living condition for somebody, whether it's a human or a plankton. But yeah, fun idea, extremely complex in practice is the summary on this one. Okay, I skipped around a little. They weren't in order anyway. They were like slightly in order. I don't know if I want to hit more offshore stuff. I'm kind of offshored out, but let's see. Yeah, there's so it makes sense. You need them, but I never thought about that. Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a lot of oil offshore, and you got to get it back to shore somehow. So another, what prevents blowouts offshore? So just as a refresher, a blowout means that there was uncontrolled pressure that made it from the reservoir up to the surface. And if it makes it all the way to the surface, that's when explosions and like shooting of oil happens. But it doesn't have to make it all the way to the surface in order to have a pressure control situation on your hands. It could just make it halfway up and cause issues. So what's happening whenever a blowout happens is when you're drilling, and this is, let's see, there was more to this question related to, like, I simplified all the questions, but this particular question was, you have no pressure at the surface, and then you have this high pressure down the reservoir. And when you're drilling down, and we can go to, let's go to this picture for this. And when you're at the surface and you just have water, and you go down and you poke a hole in this high pressured reservoir, how do you not have just an instant blowout, right? How do you even control that? Do you have to like put a choke valve or something downhole? And what we do is we use heavier and heavier fluid in order to counteract the pressure that's in the reservoir. So as you're drilling down, you're having to use just the right weight of fluid in order to control the pressure that you're dealing with at that point in the reservoir. So you might have, you're just going to have a saltwater pressure gradient going to the bottom of the ocean, right? Because you have salt water above you. So you would use something very similarly weighted to a saltwater when you're drilling or when you're going down the first, bit here. And then if you have mostly a saltwater column in the sediments, the first, maybe 1,000 feet, you could maintain using that very same fluid to maintain the pressure. But then if you got to let's say that there was a a seal, and then the next layer down had a low pressure, like there was, if you were to drill into it with that same weight, all of your fluid would go out into that reservoir. Then you would have to know going into that you're about to have a fluid loss situation, and you'd have to lighten your fluid. You'd put casing to isolate off all of the reservoir above it, switch your fluids out, and start drilling with a different fluid during that segment. And then if you hit a high pressured segment of the reservoir, there's different dynamics that can cause this to happen, different reasons that something might be a high pressured or a low pressured system. But if you hit something that was high pressured, you'd have to isolate the low pressured stuff with another thing of pipe, and then switch your fluids, and then start drilling with the heavier fluid. As you can imagine, the deeper you get, the more expensive it is to put another layer of pipe in order to isolate that. And then whether or not that pipe goes all the way to the surface, or if it's just like a little portion of pipe, is a whole nother situation. Then you have to cement that into place in order to isolate that pipe against the rock. Like there's a lot of dynamics and calculations that go into drilling, especially on the like pressure control side of it. But then eventually when you hit the reservoir, ideally you have a column of fluid that has the same weight as the pressure pushing back against it down in the reservoir, so that if you have a bubble, and the bubbles are the problem, if you have a bubble down in the reservoir, it doesn't start floating up to the surface. Because if you have something that has 3,000, 10,000 pounds of pressure on it, and the bubble is this big, if you take that 10,000 pounds of pressure and remove it from that little bubble, do you remember from science class what happens when you remove pressure from gas? Anyone remember their perv nerd, as I heard it? PV equals nRT. Pressure and volume are on the same side of the equation. So if you increase one, you decrease the other. And if you decrease one, you increase the other. So if we decrease the pressure, we're going to increase the volume. So the bubble that was this big suddenly becomes very large, and it has to still fit in these small valves. And so as that bubble starts traveling up that if you have too light of a fluid and that bubble's allowed to travel up, that bubble will slowly get bigger and more of a problem until suddenly it gets to the surface and breaks everything and causes a blowout. So that's basically what a blowout is that bubble causing a problem. A very simplified version of it, but the blowout preventers, BOPs, is a stack, like it's a very heavy duty system that they drill with, and there's different kind of safety measures that go into place when they're drilling. And so it could be anything from if there's any well control issue, it just clamps down and stops. Like it's a very high pressured clamp and seal is one way to look at it. Then there's ones that just will cut through the entire pipe and provide a cap, like instant safety seal. It's you don't want to do that, but that is your backup plan. So there's a lot, but then you have to still deal with that pressure that's there. But at least if it's controlled, you can try to figure out how to do that over time, as opposed to, well, the whole rig's on fire and exploding, which is much more difficult, as you can imagine. That's a whole nother topic, is that whole Deepwater Horizon issue that happened, and then how do you go in and fix that, and yeah. All right. Yeah, blowout preventers, well control procedures. Usually by the time that you have a well control issue, there's been a lot of other things that, like signals that you missed, cautions you didn't take, planning that maybe was skipped or assumed or not done. So usually by the time you get to that place, there's been a cascade of issues. But what time is it? 12:49. Okay. So another question was kind of on the same light, is why does some oil seep and others gush, right? So we just talked about this pressure and then have blowout preventers and balancing this high pressure stuff. But then other places you have like tar sands on the surface. Or a similar question, when you're out at the beach and you have like the globs of oil stick to your feet, and you have to, like, the hotel has the little packets to help get the oil off of you so you're not using their towels, right? Like, how is that a thing if it's so high pressured? And that is one of the thank you, Mary. So one of the guiding reasons on why certain areas make for good reservoirs is because it has sealed that oil underground. Oh, I hear Crystal. Sydney must have finished her lunch. Hi, Crystal. So when you have so all of this oil is generated underground, right? This is all stuff that needs to cook in the heat of the earth in order to become oil in the first place. And so it all starts underground. Now, sometimes you have something that keeps it from traveling up, because remember, oil is lighter than water, and most of the earth is full of, like, the rock is full of water. So naturally it's going to want to rise versus the 90% water on the earth, right? If we think about just the percentage of water on the earth, statistically, it's most likely that the oil is going to be next to water, and it's going to want to be above that water. So when that happens, it goes to the surface. Now, that's why you get these oil seeps. That's why it naturally tries to go up. That's why you have blowouts also. It's doing the same thing. It's trying to go up. But what also happens when oil is exposed to the air and less pressure is that you get more gas coming out of the oil. So first of all, like, it's that you have flat soda, basically. All of the gas that was absorbed into the liquid and you know, contained in the liquid when it was higher pressure. When you let that pressure off by taking the knob of the soda and opening it, it releases that pressure, releases the gas, and that releases some of those lighter components. And so then you're left with the heavier components. Oh my goodness, Crystal's participating. So you'll get heavier oils near the surface for that reason. And then a lot of times the tar that you get stuck to your feet at the beach, or the tar that you have at the surface, that can just be if you think about, not doing your dishes for a week and you have oil sitting on a plate, maybe from, a steak you cooked or something. Over time, that's going to become like a thicker and thicker oil because it's kind of evaporating. And that same thing happens to the oils that make it to the surface. And maybe it's natural, maybe it's unnatural, maybe it's pollution, maybe it's a natural seep. But either way, however it makes it to the surface, it will eventually start evaporating off and gassing and leaving a heavier and heavier component in the water or on the surface or on the beach, whatever it is. And so eventually you end up stepping in tar. Like that's kind of just, it'll eventually kind of wash itself to where you just have the heaviest stuff left. So some of it is that California has heavy crude, but also some of it is that it has crude very close to the surface. And some of those oil fields are only 600 to 1,000 feet deep. It's not deep at all. That sounds deep when you think about like water wells, but for oil and gas, probably the average is closer to 4,000 or 5,000 feet deep. Anything lighter than that, anything less than 1,000 feet deep, and you're getting into more of the like surface aquifer zones, where there's less likely to be a seal between that reservoir and the surface, and so you're just less likely to have oil that close to the surface. But for California, you do have quite a bit of oil close to the surface. Parts of Canada, Pennsylvania, into there's quite a few places where oil has made it quite close to the surface, if not at the surface, and that's how it was discovered in the first place. Yeah, why does it seep in some places but gush in others? So kind of covered that a little bit. If it's seeping, then there's nothing to trap it and trap that pressure. If it's not seeping, then there's probably a trap. So the pressure also probably was sealed. So you know how we were talking about that bubble, if it's under a lot of pressure and then you bring it up to the surface, it becomes a big, enormous bubble of no pressure. So the same thing happens if you have a trap on a reservoir, and then over, thousands and thousands of years, that reservoir gets buried deeper and deeper and deeper by sediment being deposited on top of it, or just natural movement of the plates. And then that pushes that ball of reservoir deeper. And then suddenly you go from, the pressure it was here to the pressure it now is deeper. And it has nowhere for it to push that pressure. So it just keeps pressurizing more. Or sometimes that can cause an underpressured reservoir if that happens too quickly. Like there's a lot of interesting things that can happen based on the movement of the rock and the trap nature of what happened. And another question. We have 4 minutes. So I'll hit this last one. I don't know if I want to hit some of these other ones today. I think I hit a lot of them, but another question was, we had touched briefly in our last live stream about how oil and gas reservoirs were not just big open caverns of oil. And I'd mentioned that because that is a common perception of what oil and gas reservoirs look like, is that if you think of a reservoir on the surface, you might think of a pond, like a tank or a reservoir, right? Like a holding tank for oil, for water. But a reservoir underground there's almost never a situation where you have just a cave of oil or a cave of water underground. It'd be very rare for that to happen, actually, and you'd probably be dealing with a cave system, like a known cave system at that point. There's a thing called karsting, which does cause larger openings in carbonate rocks, which is like the reef systems that got buried. But it's not quite the same. Let's see, do I dare search this live? I'll go to just me, see if I can find a good picture, and then I'll go back. But if you think about a sponge holding water, that's what these things look like underground. And if I were to tear a sponge that was holding water in half, I would have water fall out because I was removing some of the places for that water to be stored by tearing it in half. That's kind of what fracking is doing. Oil reservoir image. So we'll look at a simple image and why this even becomes a misconception in the first place. Here we go. Pause. I have no idea what this Engman is, but he had an image here. Okay, so this is a very common image of what an oil and gas reservoir, like a conventional, classic textbook reservoir looks like. But whenever you see gas on top of oil on top of water, that's not just a cave underground. It's in sandstone, basically, or it's in something that, like those thirsty stone coasters that absorb the water. It's in stone like that can absorb and have the water in between the pores. And so when you drill and you're drilling down, you're drilling through rock, drilling through rock, drilling through rock, and then you hit the gas cap, you're still in rock. You're just in rock that has gas in the pores rather than water in the pores. Yeah, SpongeBob. So, as you keep drilling, then you hit oil, and you're still in the same rock, but that rock is primarily, soaked in oil rather than soaked in gas. And even with all of that, the stuff that's soaked in oil and soaked in gas, there's still water in that rock. It's just different places in the pores. And so there's a lot of dynamics still happening because a lot of times this whole thing used to be full of water, and then this oil and gas went through that water in order to sit here. Like it was trying to find a way to the surface. It got stuck by the cap rock, and now it's stuck for us to discover. The dry holes, if you see like oil and gas records saying that they hit a dry hole, that usually means not that there was no liquid, but that it was only water, or not enough oil and gas. It could just mean that there was plenty of oil and gas to today's standards, but back in the 1930s, there wasn't enough oil and gas, right? There's a lot of different definitions of what a dry hole is. But it basically means they tried to drill and hit something that they tried to end the well in the oil and gas part of the reservoir, and they ended it in a place that did not have the oil and gas. Now, I don't know if I think this particular well would probably not be considered a dry hole by normal standards, unless it was like the last well drilled. But this is just a diagram. Y'all get it. And so, those are the components of a reservoir. So knowing that there is still rock in the reservoir in the same nature that there is rock in, like, if you dig down in your yard, you're going to find rock, kind of helps a lot of the other dynamics make more sense. I just saw Crystal outside, so I guess she's not going to join us today. Darn, I had my crystal cam all ready. But if you need some crystal time, go ahead and well, first subscribe, right? So you don't miss future live streams. But also, was it Friday? I did a just for fun live stream. I'm building an oil field in our like custom modded Minecraft world, and it is quite complex. Like they definitely added a lot of mods where it's more like a puzzle game, trying to figure out, okay, you made this, how do you make this next thing? Okay, you need these 18 components to make that one component. It's kind of fun. I am entertained by those type of things. We'll just say I like the detailed work like that. Surprise, surprise, engineer likes nerdy detailed work. But when I was recording just some fun play on that Crystal got the zoomies midway through, so you can like scroll through and see her knocking the camera off my desk with her toy. So if you need your Crystal fix, that's where she is. Okay, it's 1:03. I think I'm gonna call it. Last chance for questions. I know that people like to squeeze them in right at the last minute, so now's your last chance for questions. If you are watching this on the replay, go ahead and leave a question in the comments, and I will get to it next week. We will. I don't know of any reason right now why I won't be here for live stream next week. Same time, same place, Tuesday at noon. Might start doing a more planned, scheduled Friday, like casual after hours type of live stream. We'll have to see how that ends up scheduling and playing out. But, I'm enjoying it. Helps get more content out there. And so, that might be on the books, but I try not to plan stuff too far ahead. So I don't make empty promises. Anything else? Well, I hope y'all stay warm and safe and don't drive on ice if you don't have to, but hopefully everyone's having a good week. And yeah, thank you guys for joining us. Take care, stay warm to y'all also. And I'll see y'all next week. No crystal for our end of cam crystal session.